I still remember the day the doctor gave us the news. The sterile white walls of the hospital, the heavy smell of antiseptic, the look in his eyes as he told us that my little girl, my sweet, adventurous, giggly Sarah would never walk the same way again. It wasn't a car accident or a dramatic injury like you see on TV. It was a slow, invisible thief called muscular dystrophy. It crept into our lives without warning, stealing a little more of her strength every day. One afternoon, she tripped while chasing our dog in the backyard. At first, we thought it was just clumsiness. Kids fall all the time, right? But then the falls kept happening. Then came the leg braces. Then came the wheelchair talks. And finally, the scooter. I'll never forget the look on Sarah's face when we first brought the scooter home. She sat on it quietly, running her small hands along the handles, her fingers trembling just a little. "Will people stare at me, Daddy?" she whispered. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I knelt down in front of her, held her hands tight, and told her the truth. "Maybe, but who cares if they do? You're the bravest girl I know." Our community had always seemed nice enough, so I thought. We lived in one of those suburban neighborhoods where people waved while mowing their lawns and kids rode their bikes up and down the sidewalks. It was the kind of place you move to because you believe it'll be safe, welcoming. I believed that. I wanted to believe that. So when Sarah said she wanted to go outside on her scooter by herself for the first time, my heart swelled with pride. She was taking her first real step on wheels toward independence. She was so careful, so polite. She waved at every neighbor she passed. She avoided bumping into anyone. She even apologized if she thought she was in the way, even when she wasn't. Watching her ride up and down our little street, the late afternoon sun catching in her hair, I thought, maybe things are going to be okay. That hope lasted about 3 days. It started with little things. We noticed a few, more glares than usual, whispers behind closed doors. A neighbor who used to greet us suddenly turned their back. But the first time I really felt it, the first time I truly realized how cruel people can be, was when Sarah came inside crying. She wasn't hurt, not physically. No, this was a different kind of wound. One you can't see on an X-ray, I gathered. Her in my arms, smoothing her hair back, trying to calm the heavy sobs shaking her tiny frame. Through her tears, she told me what had happened. That lady, the one with the little white dog, she said I was a nuisance and that I shouldn't be riding around where people could trip over me. I froze. I knew exactly who she was talking about. Her name was Margaret, but most people around here just called her, well, you know, Karen. I wanted to march right down to her house and tell her what I thought. I wanted to protect my daughter, to shield her from every cruel word and sideways glance. But instead, I just held Sarah tighter. Because sometimes the worst kind of hurt is the kind you can't punch or argue away. That night, after I put Sarah to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring out the window into the dark, quiet street. I thought about all the times I had looked the other way when someone treated someone else unfairly. All the times I had told myself it was none of my business. Now it was my business. Now it was my little girl. I promised myself something that night. I wouldn't let her be made to feel small. Not because of her scooter, not because of her illness, not because of someone else's ignorance or cruelty. If Margaret or anyone else wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But I had no idea how far she was willing to go, or how far I would be willing to go to protect my daughter. The next morning, I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was a one-time thing, I told myself. Maybe Margaret was just having a bad day. People have bad days. But deep down, I knew better. Sarah was scared to go outside. She sat by the window with her scooter parked beside her, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit against her chest. I knelt down next to her and said, "You want to go for a ride together, sweetheart? I'll walk beside you." For a moment, hope flickered in her eyes. But then she shook her head. What if she yells at me again? My little girl, once fearless, was now afraid to ride down her own street. That night, I decided to speak with Margaret. Myself, not to fight, not to cause a scene, just to try and reason with her, parent to neighbor. Surely, if she understood what Sarah was going through, she'd soften, right? I walked down the street, rehearsing my words in my head. Be calm, be polite, explain. I rang her doorbell. After a long moment, Margaret opened the door, just a crack. She didn't greet me, she didn't smile, she just stared. "Hi, Margaret." I began, clearing my throat. I just wanted to talk for a second about Sarah, my daughter. At the mention of Sarah's name, her face tightened. "I don't have time for this," she said briskly, starting to close the door. I put my hand up, desperate to stop her, to make her listen. "Please, she's just a kid. She's not trying to be a nuisance. She's dealing with a disability, and the scooter is part of her independence. I thought maybe if you understood, that's..." When she cut me off. "No one's stopping her from being independent," Margaret said coldly. "But I moved here for peace and quiet. Not to dodge scooters in the street like it's some kind of amusement park. There are rules for a reason." I just stared at her, stunned. She looked at me like I was the problem, like my daughter's existence was an inconvenience to her carefully curated little world. Before I could find the words to respond, she slammed the door in my face. I stood there on her front porch, my fists clenched so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Tears of anger burned behind my eyes. How could someone be so cruel to a child, a sick child? I went home that night with a heavy heart. I didn't tell Sarah what happened. I didn't want her to feel even worse. Instead, I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered promises I wasn't sure I could keep. "You're safe, you're loved. Nothing's going to hurt you." I thought maybe that would be the end of it. Maybe Margaret just needed to vent, and now she would move on. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. 2 days later, a formal complaint letter showed up at our door. A letter with the HOA letterhead, signed by the neighborhood committee, Margaret being the committee's safety advisor, of course. The letter said that Sarah's mobility scooter was a potential hazard, and that repeated operation of unauthorized motorized vehicles on the sidewalks could result in fines or further action. It didn't feel real. I read the letter 3 times, standing in the kitchen, the words blurring from the tears I refused to let fall. They were threatening us. They were threatening my daughter. I thought about the countless hours we had spent teaching Sarah to be safe on that scooter, teaching her how to steer carefully, how to yield to pedestrians, how to be cautious, respectful, mindful of others. And yet here we were, being treated like criminals. I wanted to tear the letter into 1,000 pieces. Instead, I carefully folded it and put it on the counter. Because now I knew this wasn't just about Sarah's scooter. This was about people who couldn't stand to have their perfect little bubble disturbed by something or someone that didn't fit their idea of normal. That night, I sat outside on the porch, the old wooden swing creaking under my weight. The moon was bright overhead, casting long, lonely shadows across the street. I watched Margaret walk her dog along the sidewalk, her head held high, her expression proud, as if she had won something, as if taking away a little girl's freedom was something to be proud of. I thought about my parents, about how they had taught me right from wrong. They had always said, when you see injustice, you don't look away. You stand up, you fight back. I had stayed silent for too long. Margaret wanted to hide behind her rules and complaints, but I had a voice, and I was going to use it, because sometimes, when the world tries to shrink your child's dreams, you have to show the world just how big your love really is. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying it all in my mind. Sarah's happy little smile as she zipped down the sidewalk, her scooter's tiny motor humming, her laughter spilling into the air like sunshine. And then Margaret's face, her words, the letter. It felt like the world had turned against us, like our safe little home wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, tracing her finger around the rim of her cereal bowl, not eating. Her scooter sat by the door, silent, untouched. It broke something inside me to see her that way. "You okay, sweetheart?" I asked gently. She shrugged, not looking up. "Do you want to go for a ride later? We can go the long way around the neighborhood, see the flowers by the park," I offered, trying to sound upbeat, but she shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to get in trouble." Those words, those awful, heartbreaking words, stuck in my chest like a knife. My daughter wasn't afraid of falling. She wasn't afraid of getting hurt. She was afraid of being a burden to other people. At 7 years old, she already believed she was somehow wrong for simply existing. I went to the counter and stared down at the HOA letter again. I reread the cold, clinical words. Repeated unauthorized use of motorized vehicles will not be tolerated. Residents in violation will be fined. Further non-compliance may lead to legal proceedings. Legal proceedings against a child. I felt my hands shake with anger and helplessness. I folded the letter neatly, tucking it into a drawer because I couldn't bear to see it anymore. It was easier to pretend it didn't exist, just for a little while. Later that afternoon, as I was helping Sarah with her homework, a knock came at the door. I tensed immediately. I had a bad feeling. That kind of deep, low dread that settles in your bones. When I opened the door, there stood Margaret, flanked by 2 other HOA board members. All 3 wore matching tight-lipped smiles, like they were on some kind of official business. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, her voice sugary sweet. "We're here to deliver a formal notice." She handed me a manila envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I already knew it wasn't good. Margaret peered past me into the house, her nose wrinkling slightly as if just seeing Sarah's scooter offended her. "You understand, I hope," she said, almost kindly, "that it's not personal. We just have to think about the good of the whole neighborhood. Not personal. Not personal to threaten a little girl's right to ride on the sidewalk. Not personal to scare her into believing she wasn't welcome in her own home." I slammed the door before I said something I'd regret. Sarah came out of the living room, clutching her bunny tighter than ever. "Was that about me?" she asked. And for the first time, I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to protect her from the ugliness of it all. I knelt down and hugged her as tightly as I could, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, feeling the fragile thump of her heart beat against my chest. "It's not your fault," I whispered fiercely. "It's never your fault. That night, I opened the envelope. It was worse than I imagined. The HOA was demanding that Sarah cease use of her mobility scooter immediately. If we refused, they would begin fining us $100 per day. If the fines weren't paid, they reserved the right to place a lien against our home. It didn't even seem real. How could this be happening in America in 2025? I sat there at the kitchen table long after Sarah had gone to bed, the house dark and silent around me. I thought about selling the house. I thought about giving up. I thought about every path that led to us losing, and every one of them felt like a betrayal to Sarah. I couldn't move her away from her friends, her school, her doctors, all because a few bitter people wanted a perfect neighborhood. No, I wouldn't run. I wouldn't teach my daughter to back down, just because someone bigger or louder told her she didn't belong. I wiped the tears from my face and stood up. If Margaret and the HOA thought they could bully us into silence, they didn't know who. They were dealing with I was fighting for more than just a scooter. I was fighting for my daughter's right to exist, and I was just getting started. I didn't jump into action right away. That's not how real battles are won. I spent the next few days thinking, planning, waiting. Every night, after Sarah went to sleep, I sat by the window in the dark, turning things over in my mind while I watched the streetlights blink in the distance. One thing I knew for sure, I couldn't fight this alone. Margaret had the HOA board. She had their rules, their threats, their endless petty power plays. But I had something stronger, the truth. And if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's this. The truth, once seen, can't be unseen. First I gathered evidence. I took photos and videos of Sarah using her scooter, careful ones, showing how safe she was, how carefully she rode. I captured her slowing down for elderly walkers, how she pulled over politely when joggers came through, how she smiled and waved at every neighbor she passed. She wasn't a danger. She wasn't a nuisance. She was the heart of our little community. Next, I started talking. At first, it was just casual conversations, a wave at Mrs. Henderson, who always worked in her garden 2 streets down, a chat with Mr. Patel when he was getting his mail. Each time, I mentioned it lightly at first, what the HOA was trying to do, how they wanted to fine us for letting our daughter exist, how they thought her little scooter was unauthorized. I didn't push it. I just told the truth, and one by one, the looks on their faces changed. Shock, outrage, sadness, words spread faster than I could have imagined. Within a week, nearly everyone on our side of the neighborhood had heard about Margaret's complaint. One evening, Mrs. Henderson even came to our door carrying a basket of cookies. For Sarah, she said, her voice trembling with anger, and for you, don't you let those bullies win. I hugged her tightly, fighting back tears, but I knew cookies alone wouldn't stop Margaret. I needed more. That's when I got an idea, one so simple, so devastatingly effective, that I almost laughed. Sarah had a school project coming up, community and kindness. She was supposed to create a poster or video showing how kindness could make a difference in the world. I asked her, casually, if she wanted to make a little documentary instead of a poster. She lit up immediately. We spent the weekend filming. I showed her gently, without making it about the HOA, how she could film her daily rides, her stops to say hello to neighbors, how her scooter gave her freedom and joy. Sarah poured her whole heart into it. She filmed clips of herself, watering flowers for Mrs. Henderson, helping Mr. Patel carry groceries up his steps, picking up litter she found along the sidewalks, Every frame was filled with love, with light. And when it was finished, a short 5-minute masterpiece, I knew we had something powerful. I uploaded it to a private link. Then I started sharing it. Not just with neighbors, not just with Sarah's school. I sent it to the local news station. At first, I didn't expect much. Maybe a nice little online feature, if we were lucky. But by the grace of something bigger than me, the story exploded. The headline read, "Local girl's scooter sparks outrage and a movement for kindness." The news crew came out the next day. They filmed Sarah riding her scooter down the sidewalks, neighbors waving and cheering her on. They interviewed Mrs. Henderson, who told the world, voice shaking, "Sarah is the best thing that ever happened to this neighborhood. Anyone who says otherwise ought to be ashamed." And they asked me point blank about the HOA complaint. I didn't name Margaret directly. I didn't have to. I simply said, some people forget that rules are supposed to protect people, not hurt them. And when the rules start hurting our most vulnerable, maybe it's time to rethink who we are as a community. The piece aired that night, and by morning, everything had changed. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be business as usual. A few cranky homeowners, some new landscaping proposals, maybe a boring financial report. Instead, the clubhouse was packed wall to wall with angry residents. People who usually didn't even bother to show up were there. Arms crossed, faces grim. Margaret looked like she wanted to sink through the floor as she tried to call the meeting to order. One by one, people started standing up, not shouting, not screaming, just calmly, relentlessly telling the board and the cameras now rolling from local news exactly what they thought. "I moved here because it was supposed to be a community," Mrs. Henderson said, "not a dictatorship. This little girl represents everything good about our town," Mr. Patel added, "and you should be ashamed for trying to take that away." By the end of the meeting, Margaret was visibly shaking. One neighbor proposed a formal motion to amend the HOA rules to specifically protect mobility devices, especially for children, seniors, and disabled residents. It passed unanimously. Margaret didn't even stay to the end. She gathered her papers with trembling hands and fled the building while half the room watched in disgust. I stood outside with Sarah afterward, holding her hand. She didn't know everything that had happened, and I didn't tell her. All she knew was that people had clapped when she came into the room, that neighbors had hugged her and handed her flowers, that she had made a difference. "You proud of me, Daddy?" she asked, looking up at me with those wide, trusting eyes. I choked on the lump in my throat. I hugged her so tight, I thought I'd never let go. "Sweetheart," I whispered, "I'm proud of you every single day. If you're moved by my story and the way we fought for what's right, imagine how many others like us are out there, struggling against injustice. My daughter deserves to live without being treated this way, and so do countless others. If you believe in standing up for family and fighting against the odds, don't forget to subscribe. Together, we can keep sharing these stories that matter and make a difference. Your support means the world to us." Asterisk, in the days after the meeting, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter somehow, warmer. It was subtle at first. Little things. A neighbor waving from across the street who used to barely nod before. A few kids from down the block riding their bikes alongside Sarah on her scooter, laughing and racing her to the corner. Flowers showed up at our doorstep, sometimes with notes, sometimes just with a smiley face drawn on the card. It was like the entire street had exhaled a breath we didn't even know we were holding. Sarah didn't fully grasp how much had changed. She was just happy she could scoot around without anyone frowning or shaking their head. And honestly, that was enough for me too. One morning, a few weeks later, Sarah and I were sitting on the porch, sipping hot cocoa even though the sun was already warm. She was coloring a picture, something about superheroes. I was reading the paper, half listening to the birds singing from the maple trees. Mrs. Henderson walked by, slow and careful with her cane, and stopped at the bottom of our driveway. "Morning," I called. She smiled, one of those genuine, crinkly-eyed smiles that make you feel seen all the way down to your bones. "I was hoping you two might come to the block party this weekend," she said. Block party. We hadn't had one of those in years. Not since before the HOA started tightening their grip, making everyone too nervous to even gather without 10 forms and a permit. I must have looked surprised because she chuckled softly. "New board approved it last week," she said. "We're bringing back the old ways. You know, community, not control." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "We'll be there," I promised, my voice thick. Sarah looked up, beaming. "Can I bring my scooter?" Mrs. Henderson leaned down with difficulty, resting both hands on her cane. "Sweetheart," she said warmly, "you bring that beautiful scooter and ride circles around us if you want to." Sarah giggled and gave her a thumbs. Up later that night, when Sarah was asleep, I sat back on the porch alone. The stars overhead were so bright they didn't seem real. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the cool night air wash over me. The anger I'd carried for so long, it was fading. Not because what Margaret had done was any less cruel, but because somehow, some way, goodness had won. Real kindness had risen up, quietly, firmly, and pushed out the bitterness. Margaret had quietly resigned from the HOA a few days after the meeting. No announcement, no apology, just a terse letter left on the bulletin board. Rumor had it she was selling her house. I didn't feel satisfaction about that. Not really. Mostly, I just felt sorry for her, because while Sarah and I and the whole neighborhood were celebrating new beginnings, Margaret was clinging to the same cold loneliness she had built around herself. And that's the thing about building walls instead of bridges. Eventually, you trap yourself inside. The weekend of the block party arrived, and it was everything I hadn't realized I missed. Long tables stretched across the street, covered with homemade casseroles and pies. Kids chased each other with sidewalk chalk and water balloons. Someone dragged out an old boombox, and for a while, the whole street danced badly to 70s hits. Sarah zipped around on her scooter, her face alight with pure joy. At one point, she stopped in front of me, her cheeks flushed from laughing so hard. She held out her hand, that same determined little hand that had clutched mine so many times when she was scared or tired or hurt. "Come dance with me, Daddy," she cried. And even though my knees popped and my back ached just thinking about it, I set down my plate and took her hand. We spun around in clumsy, ridiculous circles. We laughed until we couldn't breathe, and for one perfect moment, I wasn't thinking about battles or board meetings or bitter neighbors. I wasn't carrying the heavy weight of worry about Sarah's future, about the world she would grow up in. I was just here, with her, in the sunshine, free, when the song ended, and I collapsed into a folding chair. Gasping for breath, Mr. Patel handed me a cold lemonade with a wink. "You're a good man," he said quietly, clinking his cup against mine. "You did a good thing." I didn't know what to say. So I just nodded, blinking back tears. The sun began to set, casting the street in gold and pink. Someone lit a bonfire in a barrel. The kids roasted marshmallows while the adults sat in lawn chairs, swapping old stories and laughing like old friends. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something important. We weren't just a collection of houses anymore. We were a neighborhood again. Sarah curled up on my lap eventually, her head heavy against my chest. Her scooter parked carefully beside us like a trusted steed. I kissed the top of her head and closed my eyes, breathing in the smell of smoke, grass, and summer air. It wasn't just a new beginning for her. It was a new beginning for all of us, and God willing, we were going to make it a good one.